Good morning, everyone. Hope the traffic jam was not too complicated this morning. Welcome to the Atlantic Council. For those who don't know, I am Andrea Montanino. I'm the newly appointed director at the Global Business and Economics Program here at the Atlantic Council, after serving as executive director and board member for the IMF up until last week. It's a great pleasure to have all of you here this morning to continue our ongoing series of discussions about the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Our focus today is how an ambitious TTIP agreement could particularly benefit the small and medium enterprises that form the backbone of the American and European economies. And you can listen from my accent, I'm European, while also being the job-creating engines for which have produced over 2/3 of all job creation on both sides of the Atlantic over the last decade. The Atlantic Council is committed to encourage the adoption of an ambitious TTIP agreement that strengthens both Europe and the United States for years to come. We want to inspire an informed and educated debate about the economic and strategic opportunities that TTIP can provide, while taking into account the concerns that citizens in both Europe and the United States have expressed about the agreement. That's why we focused so intensively on TTIP over the last year and a half, via a series of reports and the twice-weekly TTIP Action newsletter that I hope you all be getting. If don't, please go on our website, sign up, and you will find a lot of interesting things coming out twice weekly. I would like to thank the main authors of the report. Garrett Workman, the Associate Director of the Atlantic Council, is not here today, he's traveling in Europe. And also Jorn Flack, Fran Burnwell, everybody worked on this report. As I said, I arrived 5 days ago, so I didn't. We are delighted to have Congressman Erik Paulsen of Minnesota, a co-chair of the Congressional TTIP Caucus, here with us this morning. Congressman Paulsen was recently re-elected to his 4th term representing Minnesota's 3rd District. And Congressman Paulsen, thank you for being here. One of our newest board directors, Dan Price, will moderate our conversation with Congressman Paulsen. Dan is the managing director of Rock Creek Global Advisors, a political consultancy he founded after serving President Bush as his deputy national security advisor for international economic affairs. So the two guys are well placed to discuss where we are with the TTIP talks and how they can help small businesses. Gentlemen, please, the floor is yours.
Andrea, thank you very much for inviting us here, and thanks to you all for coming. Congressman Paulsen, you've been a real leader on trade issues and on TTIP in particular, having founded the Congressional Caucus on TTIP and serving as its co-chair. What explains your engagement on trade issues? Why is it important to your district? And what do you see as the upside of TTIP for the U.S. as a whole?
Right. Well, first of all, I just want to thank the Atlantic Council and for hosting me here and for inviting me and for your active engagement on this issue with TTIP, because this is a huge opportunity. And my involvement comes around the opportunity to create more jobs. It's about exports, knowing that 95% of the world's consumers live outside the United States. And I come from a district that is very cold right now in Minnesota. And we have a district that is very globally aware, and we have larger companies, of course, that export. And I think more importantly, tied to these larger companies are a lot of small and medium-sized companies that are part of the supply chain, that are looking for export opportunities to grow their companies, investing in more capital equipment, looking for new markets, and that's really important. And TTIP alone is about 3,000 new jobs in my district, and so it's going to be larger for the state, it's larger for the country, and at a time when I think both in the EU and in the United States we have sluggish growth right now. We should be doing a lot better. Trade is the antidote. Trade is the opportunity to enhance the values, the economic ties we already have, streamline regulations, make them more transparent, consistent, predictable, especially for small and medium-sized companies that need that map. And that'll grow opportunities. So it really is about jobs from my perspective, and I think we're going to have significant trade momentum in the near future.
Great. Congressman, as you look at Brussels and Washington, if there's one thing both centers know how to do, it's regulate. You might even say that Europe and the United States, vis-a-vis the rest of the world, enjoy a comparative advantage in regulation. As you've explained, part of the heart of the upside for the US and for Europe lies in regulatory cooperation, lies in finding areas for mutual recognition. What do you see as the prospect for regulatory cooperation? And if successful, what is the upside?
Yeah, the prospects are good because, again, we have strong ties already with our European friends, and knowing that nearly 50% of the world's GDP, 30% of the world's trade already flows between our economies, it only makes sense to enhance that relationship. And tariffs are already reasonably low, so even if we move the needle a little bit on tariffs, there's huge economic gain, especially in the area of agriculture, for instance. But there's no doubt that this is more about a high standards agreement and a 21st century agreement that talks more about the regulatory side of the equation, because it's those behind the border measures that might deal with testing certifications, different provisions just in the regulatory scheme, so we have similar oversight concepts. For instance, if you have a medical device company located in Minnesota that gets approval from the FDA for a device, we could set up a regulatory process through a new TTIP agreement that says if you have the appropriate oversight committee in the EU, they could also approve that device. And so we can look for those types of opportunities to streamline and modernize the regulatory process more efficiently. That'll help facilitate the movement of trades and services, goods and services much more quickly. And then that's really about jobs. And then in turn, I think the other huge benefit is that it forces other countries around the world to follow those high standards. Countries like China or others that have not been following our same model because they have other issues of intellectual property protection, and that's really the opportunity to making sure that we can have everyone else follow these high standards that we set, and that's part of the regulatory opportunity too.
Yes, yes. Congressman, you mentioned at breakfast that you were recently in Europe, and I wonder if you could comment on what you see there. I mean, you are an enthusiastic supporter. There are some in Europe, and some in particular in the European Parliament, who don't quite share the same enthusiasm for doing this large deal for the United States. What did you see over there, and what are your messages to them?
Well, a couple of things I should mention in visiting with the Europeans. Two things. Number one, they were asking questions of us and the policymakers that traveled to Brussels and London, and I was actually in Italy recently also, to talk about trade. They were asking, is the United States going to move forward? Are they going to move forward on TPA and TTIP? Is it on the top of the agenda? And our answer was, and my answer was unequivocally, absolutely. The momentum will build right after the midterm elections. This is bipartisan. Everyone in Congress and the country is expecting us to work in a bipartisan manner, and this is one of those issues that will continue to be bipartisan. Similarly as the last three trade agreements that passed, Colombia, Panama, and South Korea, were very bipartisan. And so we're looking for those opportunities. And at the same time, we help the economy jumpstart a little bit more with economic activity. And so it's a very good thing. Some of the challenges, I think, lie in the fact that someone on the European side have asked questions about, well, are there certain provisions that actually will get attention from the United States, ISDS and other issues centered around there, that we will work through. And I think as we talk to many of those newly elected officials in the EU Parliament as well, they'll come to understand the benefits to growing their economy, because we do have sluggish growth on both sides of the Atlantic. And this is really an antidote to helping accelerate the economy.
My last question to you, Congressman, and then I'll open it up to our colleagues here. The President will soon be returning after the G20 from a trip in Asia, where the dominant pieces of good news coming out of that trip were in respect of trade. The ITA breakthrough with China, progress made at the leaders' meeting on TPP, breakthrough with India on the trade facilitation agreement. What can we do to keep this momentum going? And what advice would you have for the administration?
Well, first of all, good news on the front that we've had some trade momentum building on this recent Asia trip, both in, as you mentioned, ITA, the Trade Facilitation Agreement, and TPP, which has been in the negotiation process for a longer time than TTIP, actually. What we really do truthfully need is, first of all, I should mention the USTR and Ambassador Froman have done a great job of being up on the Hill, promoting the agenda, working with members of Congress on both sides of the aisle. We need the President, when he returns, to continue to weigh in, publicly use his position to talk about the benefits of trade. You know, the elections are over, and if the administration weighs in and engages, we can get this done in short order because we'll build new momentum with many new elected members on both sides of the aisle. And I do know that with the midterm elections changing, I think we will see more momentum shortly after we first quarter of next year, right when we get going. So I'm actually really optimistic, but we do need the administration to weigh in and say this is equally important for the country and for them on a bipartisan perspective. And if they do that, it'll even happen quicker.
Thank you. Let me open it up. We've got time for several questions. Yes. Microphone is coming.
Oh, okay, thanks. Jim Berger from Washington Trade Daily. Mr. Paulsen, how important is it for Congress to approve TPA, since that can advance it well in advance of TPP and TTIP? How important is it to sort of outline what the agenda is? The administration, the president seem to say, well, if you have a good agreement, Congress will pass it. Is that true? Or?
No, we need TPA to move forward on these agreements. We absolutely have to have TPA. That message has been communicated, from Chairman Camp, from others that have been a part of the trade discussions to the administration. So it's very important that we have that because this is also Congress's opportunity, and that's how the system works, to making sure we're telling the administration what the priorities are through Congress if we're going to have that up and down vote. And that in turn makes sure that everyone's putting their best offers on the table. So we can have, our other allies or others that are part of these trade negotiations in other countries need to know that Congress is not going to be changing or altering these discussions or their agreements when they put their best offers on the table. And so TPA is very, very important. And I think the bipartisan components that were already negotiated under Senator Baucus before he left in his new position will continue to be the framework that it's possible it could even happen in the lame duck because there are opportunities now for doing things bipartisanly in the near future. So I think it's going to move forward in short order.
Thank you. Yes, your hand was up. Jim, if you could pass the mic down. Oh, there we go.
Thank you. Good morning. Jordan Valdez of the Podesta Group, formerly of the SME negotiating team on the TTIP at the SBA. Isn't it also true that the president exercising some level of executive authority over the trade agreements could be an alternative to pushing TTIP through as opposed to awaiting TPA?
Well, again, I think the fact is that, Congress has the authority to, based on our system, we delegate to the president where the negotiation priorities are, and then Congress will vote on these treaties. That's the process. And TPA is a central part of that. Working with Ambassador Froman, I think that communication and that relationship is pretty set, and there's an understanding there, even as the TPP negotiations come to a close, potentially. TPA has to happen first. It will happen first, bipartisanly, by the way, again. So I think that's just the direction we're going, and that makes sense.
Yes. And this will be our last question. The Congressman has a leadership meeting.
My name is Walter Jurassic W. in Air Global Enterprise. Last year I was in the meeting in the Export-Import Bank, which is tremendously help for small businesses. Mm-hmm. Now I heard about this issue with the Congress, if they keep the Export-Import Bank or not. And also, what is the effect of a monopoly industries on small businessmen and small export-import business?
Well, I didn't understand the second part of your question on the monopoly.
The big manufacturers, the monopoly.
Okay.
And during the Roosevelt, he divided the monopolies, and now we see only bigger monopoly manufacturers. It's very difficult to small business to go and export, import when we have a control by the monopolies.
Sure, sure. Well, first of all, I should mention, the Export-Import Bank, which arose as an issue just a few months ago, has been put off until next year, early next year, right? Until, I think, May, I think. So that issue will be dealt with on its own. And I know there are many members of Congress that are looking for some reforms and at the same time understanding there's some value with small companies, making sure there's access to credit, et cetera, and working through that process. And I think as that discussion continues, it'll work itself out. And so that'll happen in the next several months. On the side of how SMEs, that's part of your whole conversation this morning with small and medium companies, making sure they can benefit from trade, making sure that their pipeline as a part of the supply chain is going to grow and continue to do really well. That's, I think, borne evident in the discussion you're going to have today based on the surveying, based on the statistics, based on the real data that says this is not about large companies or corporations controlling everything or having monopolies. It really is about making sure we're growing high-valued manufacturing, which primarily is happening at small and medium-sized levels. And that's the reality in today's economy. And these small companies are looking for new markets, and that's where the new market opportunities are, not only in Asia, where the emerging markets are, but also with these regulatory behind-the-border measures with TTIP. And that's why I think TTIP has such strong bipartisan support and is co-chair of the caucus with co-chair members Rich Neal and Bill Keating from Massachusetts, and they're all in. They're all in for this agreement, and they want to see it happen. And so I'm excited about this agenda and looking forward to working with the Atlantic Council. And it's going to take all of you and the trade advocates that might be in this room to continue to work to move this agenda forward as well. So thank you.
Well, Congressman, it remains for me only to thank you, not only for coming this morning, but for your leadership on this issue, and to wish you well in persuading your colleagues on this side of the Atlantic and on the other. Please join me in thanking the Congressman.
Thanks, Andy. All right, I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, Congressman Paulsen, for being with us today. And let me take 1 minute of your time to thank Raj Subramanian, the Executive Vice President of FedEx, for being here in Washington with us today. FedEx has generally sponsored this work on TTIP and small businesses, because both the Council and FedEx share a common belief that the future of competitiveness of the United States and European Union is of paramount importance to our citizens' business and share global leadership. So I would like to invite Raj on the floor, on the stage, to discuss with Frank Brownwell the report on TTIP and SMEs. Please.
Thank you, Andrea. It's great to be at the Atlantic Council, and congratulations on your new appointment. It's great to be here today at this time, especially as we sit upon this very big strategic opportunity for these two large economies as we work towards untangling the processes that hold back the potential. There's $2.5 billion of goods that travel between the countries every single day. And there is significant opportunity to make it better. If we can break down the trade barriers and the bottlenecks, it makes the economic growth more robust. I mean, we talk to businesses every day, and our feedback is very constant, that they would export more, especially if the bottlenecks are removed. Now, this is especially true for our small and medium customers. Some of them are here today in the room. And it's disproportionately more so. There is no separate department that deals with these kind of issues. In fact, the time for entrepreneurs is extremely valuable, and time is money. So, it's no wonder then, out of the 23 million SMEs in the US, only 1.3% of them export. And oh, by the way, in Europe, the number is about 13% that export out of Europe. The point here is that the potential is large. And when you talk to them, they do want to export more. It's also clear that the SMEs that export do better than the ones that don't. So here is an opportunity, a deficit-neutral way to really expand economic growth. There are many things I hear all the time, but I'll talk about three. No tariffs, simplifying product testing, and having an $800 de minimis. I came in from London last night. You came in from Germany. We could have carried $800 duty-free across the border. But why is it not the same when you ship it across the border? This is a great opportunity. I believe it's a great time for a strategic partnership. And by that very definition, it means a great opportunity for a creative problem-solving approach and seeing trade as a two-way street. I'm looking forward to hearing from you, Fran, about the study and the findings from the study that you just completed. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Raj. And if I were to answer in one sentence of what we found out in this report, I would say that it is that SMEs are vital not only to our economy generally, but to our export economy. But they face obstacles, and TTIP is essential if they are to achieve their full potential and bring more jobs and growth to the United States and Europe. But before going forward and explaining how we reached that conclusion, let me first thank FedEx and your team. Your commitment to growing the SME export market has made it possible for us to do this work. I also want to thank the many leaders from small and medium-sized companies who were generous with their valuable time and willing to answer our questions. We have a couple of them here with us today, and we will hear from them in a few minutes. Special thanks to Garrett Workman, Associate Director of the Global Business and Economics Program, who's actually in Europe doing kind of a pre-presentation of this report at a couple of top economic conferences and business conferences in Europe. And to Jorn Fleck of the Transatlantic Relations team, who was involved in every aspect as well. I have to also give a big shout out to our interns over the past 6 months who have really worked hard on collecting data and putting stuff together for us. Now let me explain how we reached this conclusion. As Andrea said earlier, the Atlantic Council views TTIP as an immensely important objective, one that could enhance the strategic value of the US-European relationship, but also bring economic benefits at a time when that is needed on both sides of the Atlantic. In looking at the potential economic benefits of TTIP, the Atlantic Council published a study that examined the impact of a moderately ambitious agreement on each of the 50 states. Many of you have seen that report or seen reports about it. We also studied the impact on several sectors in the US economy, including manufacturing and chemicals. But in doing this work, we realized we were hearing a lot about the benefits of TTIP for large companies, what you might call the transatlantic giants, Ford, VW, Siemens. And we were sometimes asked, so how widely will the benefits be spread of such a trade agreement? Or is it only an agreement that's going to benefit big business? So we started to look into small and medium enterprises, and we came across some very interesting statistics, some of which Raj pointed out earlier. More than 95% of US and European firms are SMEs, defined as an enterprise of less than 500 people in the United States and 249 people in Europe. Most of the job growth in both the US and Europe comes from small and medium enterprises. In the US, 2/3 of job growth over the past 20 years, some 14.3 million jobs, is due to SMEs. In Europe, SMEs created 85% of new jobs in 2002 to 2010, and we all know that the economic priority on both sides of the Atlantic is doing something about the persistently high unemployment that we are experiencing. Most SMEs do not export. In Europe, only 25% export beyond their home country, and only 13%, as Raj said earlier, export beyond the borders of the EU. In the US, it's really small, less than 2% of SMEs export. However, those SMEs that do export grow economically, while those staying in the domestic market are more likely to see flat or no growth. In the US, between 2002 and 2009, exporting SMEs grew by 37%, while non-exporting SMEs contracted by 7%. In the EU, those SMEs that exported grew their payroll by 7%, while non-exporting grew only by 1%. So clearly, whatever we can do to encourage SMEs to export will have follow-on effects that are much bigger for our economies as a whole. And today, if an SME does have a good or service that is exportable, not all of them do, but if they do, it should, in theory, be much easier. There's eBay, there's Etsy, all these things that can help them reach their customers. So why don't more small and medium-sized companies export? We conducted a series of interviews, probably altogether close to 100 companies on both sides of the Atlantic, as well as consulting with experts from trade associations and small business associations, and reached some conclusions about the obstacles that SMEs must overcome to export successfully. These include a lack of information or confusing information about the export process, including rules on labeling, shipping, and required certifications. Number two, it was extremely difficult to assess the export market. And even if you could figure out what was going on in another country's market, it was sometimes difficult, often difficult, to find a distributor who could help you. Three, the cost of exporting, including shipping fees, as well as tariffs and duties. And four, differing regulatory requirements. Depending on the product, there may be quite different regulatory processes in the US and the EU. It may need to be manufactured slightly differently, or there may be different testing processes, a whole range of different impacts from differing regulatory requirements. Of course, all firms, large and small, face many of these obstacles. Car companies have to deal with them, as well as the manufacturer of small widgets, or the small manufacturer of widgets. But our interviews made clear that small and medium-sized firms have lower profit margins, so they have very narrow margins, and any additional cost is really a challenge. And secondly, they don't have the expertise for the most part. They've been finding their way in their domestic market, and now they suddenly have to deal with trade facilitation issues and all these other customs issues, and they don't have the lawyers or consultants or experts on those particular issues that can help them, while most of the large companies already have that. So in one case we found, for example, the paperwork was so onerous that this company was eligible for a refund on some export duties, but simply paid the duties because it had tried to deal with the paperwork and just could not. So can we put up the slide of the, yes. So here you can see some of the results. And for US exporters to Europe, those that already export, you can see that tariffs and duties and costs are the main thing that they were concerned about. Regulatory process differences, but then you quickly get to customs red tape, logistical issues, technical standards, et cetera. The next one. And in Europe, those that already export, it is the cost of exporting, tariffs and duties, intellectual property rights, technical standards, regulatory process differences. The next one. So there's an interesting difference here, is that when you have not already started exporting, so these are US SMEs that have not yet started exporting, and European SMEs that are not yet exporting to the United States, and you can see that lack of information, and even concerns about getting paid, which I would say is a concern about is a problem with information rather than anything else. Both of these have elevated considerably in the obstacles, in the list of obstacles. And so I think that shows that when you're not yet exporting, it's just this huge difficulty in terms of figuring out what you need to do. What are the rules? Where is the rule book? How do you play in that arena? So will TTIP reduce these obstacles to exporting from SMEs? Well, it depends, of course, on what TTIP eventually looks like, but one way of assessing this is to look at past experience. NAFTA, which was not as ambitious as TTIP, saw an increase in SME exports to the NAFTA region. So that SME are now 95% of the exporters. Early indications from the US-Korea trade agreement and even the EU-Korea trade agreement show some increase in SME exports, despite a lot of restrictions still remaining. It's also clear that both the EU and the US believe that TTIP can and should remove a barrier to SME exports. TTIP is actually the first EU trade agreement with a specific SME chapter. And for the United States, we have now introduced this not only for TTIP, but also for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And in a few minutes, we'll have representatives of USTR and DG Trade on our panel to discuss this effort. This is also not the first time that US and EU officials have recognized the potential value of SMEs. The Transatlantic Economic Council developed an MOU that includes some ideas on information sharing and networking. And these could be incorporated into a TTIP SME chapter. So based on our interviews with SMEs and other research, we recommend the following measures to help SMEs reach their full export potential and thus help the US and Europe grow their economies. Some would be desirable anyway. You would want them, even if you weren't focusing on SMEs, you'd want them in the trade agreement. But I think that there is also an opportunity for some special measures that would be particularly useful to SMEs. So first, eliminating transatlantic tariffs. Although tariffs are generally low, they do spike in some areas, such as cosmetics, textiles, apparel, where SMEs operate. And even low tariffs can have a big impact on very low profit margins. 2, raise duty-free limits. Raj gave a great example of this earlier. Shipping directly to customers is often the very first way that someone starts exporting. Someone sees something on eBay or something like that and they ship it cross-border, and you have to deal with the duties there. 3, simplify product testing and certification processes. This would help not only larger manufacturers, but smaller companies. There have been some suggestions that SMEs should be given extra time to comply with licensing requirements and other things of that nature, new regulations that come into force. I think that's something worth exploring. There would be a lot of pros and cons about that, and of course it would depend on health and safety issues as well, but that's definitely worth exploring. Recognize equivalent standards. More mutual recognition of standards and testing procedures would reduce the burden on exporters without threatening the health and safety of consumers, I think, given the high standards on both sides of the Atlantic. Make the regulatory process easier to understand and more transparent. In particular, the US and EU could create sector-specific web-based platforms that clearly outline the rules and regulatory processes for exporters to help overcome that confusion about information in the rule book that we saw from our study. There might even be a way to give SMEs additional training so that they know better how to comply with the new rules. And there also should be more thorough impact assessment of new regulations on SMEs particularly. 6, demystify the export process by providing easy-to-understand resources that connect SMEs to potential customers. Matchmaking efforts by governments, business associations, export promotion authorities can be immensely valuable. A sector-specific database of companies and distributors could help novice exporters find the right market. Government procurement websites could publicize tenders and make them available in both the US and EU to SMEs. Finally, number 7, expand export promotion programs that work and make sure SMEs know about them. It's often very haphazard as to whether you find a program that works for you or not. So we need to figure out a way to make this more systematic. Some programs, such as the Commerce Department Golden Key program, which joins exporters with distributors, have been very valuable. But many programs are difficult to find. So let me close by reiterating that I think we have here in TTIP a great opportunity to boost one of the most vital elements of the transatlantic economy. By making it easier for SMEs to export, we should see more growth and jobs on both sides of the Atlantic. In a minute, we're going to hear from those most involved, business leaders from the SME sector and negotiators from the US and the EU. So I understand our crack events team is going to do a slight reshuffle up here, and this is the equivalent of the 7th inning, very brief stretch, and we will be right back up here in a second. Thank you. we have a great panel here today to follow up, and I think it's one thing to have a report that has data and that has some interviews and things like that, but when I talk to people about TTIP and actually about some of the opposition that it is facing, what people say to me is, what does this mean in my local area? What does it mean to my local businesses? Give me some stories. If they're politicians, they say, give me some stories I can use in talking to my district. And we have, I think, some people here who have both the technical expertise and the negotiating expertise, but also we have the people here with stories, with real life expertise. So this is really, I think, an innovative and interesting way in the Washington policy sphere to actually bring things together. So let me just very briefly do some introductions. We have Roy Paulsen over here, who is the president of Paulson Manufacturing, which exports to 100 countries and specializes in safety and security products, so like safety glasses and stuff like that. Okay. He holds a number of patents, and he also chairs several organizations, business-oriented organizations such as the National District Export Council and the Riverside County Manufacturers and Exporters Association. We have Elena Steigemann, Director of International Business at a company called NuStep, that's N-U-S-T-E-P, which produces exercise equipment and consumer goods. She has been an advisor on the federal level to the industry trade advisory committees, which advise the Secretary of Commerce, the U.S. Trade Representative, and others. And she also serves on the Michigan District Export Council. We have Raj Subramanian, who has been already introduced, so welcome back up here to the panel. And we have then Cristina Sevilla, Deputy Assistant USTR for Small Business. And I think it's great that there's actually a Deputy USTR for Small Business. She has worked on the National Export Initiative, which aims to double U.S. exports by 2015 and support U.S. jobs. She also teaches part-time at G.W. Elliott School, for those of you who want to do trade politics. And also we have Damien Levy, the brand new head of Trade and Agriculture section at the delegation of the European Union. But he is not new to this negotiation because he's been one of the key people in Trade Commissioner Karel de Gucht's cabinet and also headed the US and Canadian team at the European Commission as Deputy Chief Negotiator of TTIP. So he's now he's been in the trenches and he remains in the trenches. So let me start with Roy. How did you decide to get into exporting? And what kind of a difference has that made for you? How important is that for you?
Thank you. It was quite a few years ago now, more than a decade, that I decided that I wanted to expand Paulson Manufacturing into the international marketplace. And where better to get started than into the European marketplace? One is I was already familiar with Europe from taking my vacations there. That's helpful. And I knew that this was a place that you could more or less speak English almost anywhere. There was the rule of law. And there was regulated marketplaces where I particularly like to sell into regulated marketplaces. And through the help of, through the U.S. Chamber, through the U.S. Commercial Service, there was a lot of information available on how to get started. But there were the things I needed to learn on my own. And I can say right from the top, the most important thing in moving into the European theater is you have to learn how to have business relationships that are much deeper than what we have necessarily here in this country. Because it's relationship selling that we're working with. It's not who has the cheapest salt. It's who has the relationship, can deliver the salt, be a reliable partner, and really ensure that the Europeans consider you to be someone who they can depend on and almost as if you were from Europe. I've been very successful in Europe. I decided on a brick and mortar approach. I have employees in Europe. I have engineers in Europe. And I have a nice building there that is housing a lot of product. But one doesn't need to take that giant leap to do that. And I did plenty of sales there before I decided to build a distribution location. The Europeans do not think of me particularly as being from the USA, because I'm ensuring that everybody makes money. I'm making money, the Europeans are making money, and the end users are getting a good price. But it's a circumstance that I have to ensure that all this happens, because I want sustainable business. I will also say that in my particular case, I'm very familiar with what it takes to bring a new norm into Europe, because I saw that there was a space, there was a hole, and I was there to fill it. And I wanted to fill it because I wanted to make money. But to be able to sell the products, I first had to create a norm that required my products. And so I went through these efforts, it was relatively expensive to do this, not necessary for other people to do it, but I saw the opportunity. And when I see an opportunity, believe me, I'm going to be right there to take advantage of it. But we developed the norm, and we did a university study. We worked with the Berufsgenossenschaft in Germany to establish this as a requirement in industry. And then that has now spread through all of the EU. And of course, this brought my products along. Because I learned this from raising teenagers. It's very difficult to push a string, but it's much easier to pull it. So by creating a circumstance that pulled the string, it pulled my products and brought them over. We had to solve a lot of regulatory issues, and we did it. We had to find out how to get our products there at a price landed in Europe that was appropriate for their market. And I have concerns about the TTIP. Mm-hmm. My concerns are that I might not be able to keep up with the production.
Well, that's a good concern that everyone should have. Can I ask you to be a little bit more specific and say a few words about your product in terms of, I understand, I mean, this sounds to me like it's a very regulated type of product. But tell us a little bit about that. And it sounds like instead of saying, oh, the European regulatory system is a horrible obstacle and I can't cope, you kind of went in this other direction. Do you think that this is unique to your sector, or is this, do you see more possibilities for this type of thing?
I think that anyone could have done a similar thing as what we did. Let's start off with what the products are that we're selling. It's eye and face protection. Everybody here has seen my products your whole life. You just didn't know that I was making it. And if a fireman was to come into this room, the clear shield on his helmet would be made at Paulson Manufacturing. Or when you saw the Greek riots, the safety equipment that the police wore in Greece that was plastered all over the news was all made in my factory in Temecula, California. Made in California because we provided a warranty that was appropriate for the Greek government that no one else would provide. And by the way, there was not one single warranty call on any of our products that were delivered. But in these cases, where we're making products that protect people and it's safety items, they're highly regulated in Europe. And I make products that I sell worldwide, but especially also in Europe, that if the product fails, the person will be killed in less than 1/10 of a second. And these are items that are for protection of electrical workers throughout Europe. So we had to become CE on a high level.
Right.
Our factory has to be inspected by a third party from Europe because of our particular type of items. And working back and forth, I also realized how close the US standards and the European standards are. And because they're so close, I have great hopes that we can find a melding of these standards over a period of time. And I personally believe that these standards can be melded together, because I know in our particular industry, which a lot of these standards have to do with safety equipment, which is on a very high level, they are already very close. However, I have to have all my products certified in Europe separately. I cannot sell, I cannot even display at a trade show products that are not certified in Europe. They will be pulled from the shelf in a trade show unless you have the EN 166 certification identified and you have your document package to show it. This is difficult for the US businesses to understand, but this is the way that their rules are, and if we're going to play in their field, or vice versa, we have to learn the rules.
Right. Elena, let me move to you. I understand that you used to work for a much larger company.
Correct.
GE?
GE.
So how does this differ now that you're working for a smaller company? What are the different things that you've experienced in terms of exports?
That's a great question. Thank you, Fran. Well, when I first came to New Step, which back then, which was 5 years ago, was just over 50 people and has now grown to about 100. To sum up, my reaction was, wow, so different. To go from a global corporation to a family-owned business. We're in a small town in Michigan called Ann Arbor, go blue. So culturally, it's a huge difference. So again, I would sum up the differences between a large exporter like GE or any other big corporation versus a small, let's say, mom and pop shop. The two main differences are resources and culture. So the resource part of it has been alluded to several times. It's included in the report, and it's very well discussed. But when we talk about resources, of course, we're talking about people. So for example, when I was at GE and I did a very similar job there, I had in-house international counsel. So if we had a question about an export contract or a product certification or requirement, I could just walk down the hall and talk to somebody who was available to me 24/7. We had an international team. We had warehousing. We had logistical capabilities all over the world. We had employee exchange programs so that people from overseas came and worked with us in our factory in New York, and then our own employees were sent overseas. So we had a lot of cultural and in-house know-how about exporting and about the world outside of our doors. So coming to New Step, I'm the Director of International Business. Our team is all of 2 people. There's 100 people in the company, and a large number of them are involved in some way in the exporting efforts that are underway, but the people who are dedicated to exporting are just 2 out of 100. And so between the 2 of us, we have to figure out how to travel to the 25+ countries to which we're exporting. We have to learn everything that's involved, all the regulatory requirements, the paperwork, how to create an invoice if you've never exported, how does it look? We don't have an in-house team that studies product requirements and everything that our product has to meet to comply with, specific to this topic, with regulatory requirements in the EU. So one of the challenges that I have as a person who's responsible for growing this international business, and we have some pretty aggressive growth targets because we're a business and this has to be a profitable operation for us to continue to export, is if we're entering a new European market, well, what are the requirements that our product has to meet? How do we find this out? Before we even go down the path of deciding that we want to make the investment to make our product compliant. So, there are a lot of challenges that are involved in not having the resources in-house. And then myself as a person who has to make the strategic decision, I then have to convince my company, the leadership of our company, that yes, in fact, we do as a company want to make the investment up front to make our product compliant with EU regulations before we even had a chance to sell a single unit there. And you know, even for those of you who are not in business, who are in attendance here, you can imagine that's quite a challenge. You know, how do you go about doing that? So there's an internal obstacle too that we have to overcome.
Great. Is your market, how regulated is your market in Europe? And are you facing some of the same challenges that Roy is in terms of certification and things like that for exercise equipment?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's kind of counterintuitive. We're talking about exercise equipment, and why is that a heavily regulated market? Well, the interesting thing is once we start exporting to the European Union, and actually in any other country, very often our products are sold into hospitals because they're uniquely made to address the needs of people who have some kind of a physical limitation. So it can be used by able-bodied individuals as well as people who are infirm, have some limitations maybe because they're older. So we do sell into hospitals as well as gyms. And in fact, hospitals make up a large part of our target markets. And so if you want to sell a new step into a hospital in any European market, you have to have medical CE mark. Yeah, you have to meet those requirements. So in order to meet the requirements, the CE mark, Class 1 Medical Device Directive, you know, that's not an easy undertaking. It's not an overnight thing. So I had an opportunity last year to address members of the European government in Belgium. And the topic was on regulatory barriers to exporting. And I kind of talked at length about our specific example. And people were kind of eating it up. And I thought, wow, they're really getting it. And then a couple of people from the EU came up to me at the end and said, but why is this so difficult? It's so easy. And I was just like, well, OK, you come over here and you work with me inside our company, where we don't have the internal expertise. Now we have to go and hire a consultant to tell us what the requirements are. Then we have to go and hire somebody to walk us through the process. Then we have to hire somebody to test our product. So it takes a long time, and it takes a commitment in terms of our budget to go down that path. So It's not easy.
Right. And do you have production facilities in Europe, or is it all in the U.S. and then you ship it?
It's all in the U.S. in our factory in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So
Okay.
We're very proud of the fact that we employ locally. Everything is made in our factory. So we hire local people who are paid appropriately.
Mm-hmm.
And we make a great product in our factory, and we ship it in containers all over the world.
Great. Yeah. Thank you. Raj, you and FedEx have been dealing with SMEs for ages, and I think helping them take some of their first steps towards exporting. As I mentioned, when people see things on the web and decide to buy it across national borders, et cetera. Are these stories the types of ones that you are hearing? Are there other, you mentioned the duties earlier, but are there other things that you are hearing from your customers and potential customers that would really help make them stronger exporters?
Fran, this is very, very consistent with what we're hearing from across the board, and that's why this is very exciting here. And I'm also thrilled that we have a specific chapter on SMEs as part of TTIP. I think this is going to unlock the potential. Now, just think about, you just talked about the internet, but actually the confluence of the electronic network and the physical networks of systems like FedEx, put it together, there's the opportunity to really expand trade, specifically in the SME sector, is very large. And if you look if the 28 countries, if there's a common platform for communications, if we have alignment of regulations that we just talked about, and a place for the small business to go find it, and then if new rules come in, then they become part of that framework. I mean, it's just seems kind of basic, but I think there's those kind of things. I think the upside opportunity. You said 1.3% of SMEs export today. The upside opportunity is quite large.
Right. So you're looking also not just at, obviously you spend a lot of your time thinking about trade facilitation issues or customs issues and things like that. And we've all had the frustrating experience of having even documents just stopped at customs. And I just can imagine what it would be for a treadmill or whatever. But also at how do you actually get the information to SMEs?
Well, I think, as you know, we think about it in two ways. And what's the behind the border? I mean, making sure that there's regulatory coherence before the shipping process even begins, and again, making sure that people understand what the regulations are. Then the shipment moves, and then at the border, where customs. I mean, we're talking about very advanced systems here. But still, there's opportunities to streamline, and as we talked about earlier with the Congressman, great opportunity to set the stage or standard for other economies to follow. I mean, I think there are opportunities both behind the border and at the border. There's no point in getting there as quick as possible and then having to wait at the cage. So it's a great opportunity here.
And I think you made the excellent point that whatever we agree in TTIP for these types of things could easily be expanded to other countries that have the capacities of implementing them, which would be a lot. So, Christina, let me turn to you. Now that you've heard the perspective of some people who are, shall we say, in the trenches, the business people who are dealing with, as SMEs, with exports, can you talk a little bit about what your ambitions are for this TTIP in terms of assisting SMEs or addressing these issues? And particularly, this is a big step to have an SME chapter, or at least it looks like a big step. So why did you particularly decide this time to have such a chapter? What was the thinking behind that?
Well, thank you to the Atlantic Council for convening this important forum on SMEs, and to experts like Elena, who's on our Industry Trade Advisory Committee, and Roy, who's president of the District Export Councils. I just want to point out that Elena and Roy are not the exception in terms of the role of small business in exporting and international trade, which is not widely recognized. As Fran said, 98% of exporters in the United States are small and medium-sized enterprises. They account for about 30% of the value of trade, but if you also account for indirect exports by SMEs that participate in supply chains, it's about 40% of the value of U.S. trade. So these small businesses like Elena's and Roy's employing workers in California and in Ann Arbor account for 4 million jobs in the U.S., according to independent research by the USITC. And in the EU, it's an even larger number, as the Atlantic Council report has pointed out. I believe DG Trade has a statistic of about 6 million jobs in the EU are in SMEs which export. But there's a huge opportunity through the TTIP to reduce the burdens that can disproportionately fall on small business in dealing with the remaining obstacles and barriers to trade that are still in the transatlantic marketplace. I thought it was very interesting from your study that it's common, tariffs are sort of dismissed because maybe they're just a small hassle for the big companies, for the biggest companies. But if you look at your charts there, tariffs are in the top two issues of both U.S. and EU SMEs that already export to that market, as well as those companies that have never exported before. And that is really, those are our two groups. We want to encourage those SMEs who are mostly in the U.S. export to just one market when they begin to export, to export to more markets, and so that is with the EU. We want to lower the trade barriers and make it easier for small businesses to find customers and suppliers and partners in 28 EU countries, and vice versa for the EU. Basically, we're seeking through a very comprehensive and ambitious trade agreement to create a potential market of 800 million new customers for small businesses on both sides of the Atlantic to create jobs. And in products and services, in agriculture, the thousands of types of goods and services that SMEs create and sell to foreign customers, we see that the TTIP writ large will benefit SMEs we want the SME chapter itself to be a tool and a platform for the type of lack of information about how to leverage opportunities across the agreement is a key barrier that the Atlantic Council has identified. So providing SMEs and helping them with the online tools and information that they need to take advantage of the new market access opportunities that we'll create. Deepening cooperation has been a key element. The U.S. and EU under the TEC, the Transatlantic Economic Council, began since 2010, bringing together stakeholder SME workshops on both sides of the Atlantic to identify both trade barriers as well as areas where the U.S. and EU are ripe for cooperation, particularly in the areas of SME networking, matchmaking, trade promotion, trade shows, trade activities. I've heard a lot from Roy and Elena here that it's finding those distributors, it's finding those partners, it's sector-specific resources. That's what we envision with the chapter, as well as sort of creating a permanent and living platform to bring together SMEs on the U.S. and EU side through these ongoing workshops in Brussels and Washington and outside in the member states as well as in the states. We see that the TTIP will reduce costs and the disproportionately burden SMEs, and we have done some systematic research on this through a series of 28 roundtables around the United States, a report by the U.S. International Trade Commission, so we can hear from hundreds of businesses and many more, like Elena's and Roy's, about the trade barriers and opportunities that they see in the transatlantic relationship, and how we can use the TTIP to reduce these types of barriers. So eliminating tariffs. I'm really glad that the Council put that in there, because with an SME operating on a razor-thin margin, that alone, 3 to 4% cost difference can make a difference. We want to reduce the paperwork. We want to save time. We want to reduce costs. We want to reduce risks that small businesses face when venturing abroad. And we do that, for example, we've heard a lot about customs red tape and logistics. We want to reduce the paperwork. We want to be able to, a small business could have the same set of information requirements for U.S. and EU customs authorities, that paperwork could be automated, that it could be processed in advance, that your goods could be released in hours, not in days, that we could have messaging about, better transparency about the status of your shipment. No more wondering, if you're a small business, where is my shipment sitting in the U.S. or the EU customs authority? High and commercially significant customs de minimis is a strong objective of the U.S. We've proposed the highest level de minimis that we hope that will set a global standard, because we've heard from small sellers in online commerce and small sellers that utilize FedEx services that, when they're they're sending their first shipment abroad, let's make that shipment above below a commercially meaningful high de minimis, not subject to those processing formalities that can take up so much of a small business's time. We want them to focus on growing their business, not on customs paperwork and logistics. It's been mentioned that e-commerce holds tremendous potential for small businesses, and this is something that has only been really realized in the last 5 years. I think the last 5 years we've gone from 2 to 3 billion internet users, small businesses, and actually we've met a lot with eBay and Etsy small businesses that sell online. They are primarily 80% women-owned businesses and primarily 1- and 2-person businesses working out of the home. So customs de minimis and e-commerce, maintaining an open and free internet, maintaining duty-free treatment of goods sold, of digital goods, of allowing small businesses to transfer their data freely across borders, utilize internet servers in any location for their business. This is hugely important to both businesses selling hard goods as well as these e-commerce businesses that are growing and thriving online, whether it's in software, ICT, video games, fashion design. All of these companies are using e-commerce to grow their businesses and access U.S. and EU and global customers 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There have been studies by eBay and others, that online SMEs are much more likely to export than offline, to, on average about 19 or more foreign markets. Regulatory cooperation is absolutely huge. We heard that in our US ITC report, and we've heard that from our SME experts here. We see that comprises two aspects, something that's called regulatory coherence, transparency, participation, and accountability in the development by US and EU authorities of regulations. We want to see draft regulations and impact assessments posted online, and thank you for the Atlantic Council's recommendation on this, and that SMEs, wherever they're domiciled, in the US or EU, can comment on draft regulations and impact assessments that may seriously impact their business while they are still in development, while there's an opportunity to have regulators hear directly from small businesses how that regulation could impact their business, in time for those regulations to be able to still to be modified, to take into account. And this would help not only US small businesses commenting on EU regulations or vice versa, but small businesses throughout the member states who don't have time to go to Brussels or Washington. So we need to put this online and open for stakeholder participation. We also would like sector-specific cooperation. We've heard about these recommendations from the Council. A large majority of SMEs are in sectors like medical devices. Over 80% are medical devices like New Step and others, or in chemicals, in autos. I've met a lot with auto suppliers, including in the EU, like in Germany and in Austria. SMEs are a huge part of the auto supplier network, and covering the auto sector, both the suppliers, as well as the sector at large, will help SMEs who are participating throughout the auto supply chain, supporting hundreds of thousands of jobs on both sides of the Atlantic. So reducing costs, reducing paperwork, reducing risks through, reaffirming our high levels of IPR protection. Many of our SMEs, I know Roy has numbers of patents and the same on the EU side. These are IPR intensive SMEs. The US and EU have strong standards of protection, but we can develop more tools to help SMEs on both sides better understand how to protect their brand, how to protect other intellectual assets in US and EU markets. We heard through our US ITC report that SMEs fully don't often understand how to do that in each other's markets, and we can create help point them to tools through our IPR cooperation and in the SME chapter as well. And then, again, utilizing the SME chapter to strengthen the cooperation that the U.S. and EU can do together by matching together our service providers that assist SMEs. So in the U.S., that's U.S. Export Assistance Centers. In the EU, the European Enterprise Network has 600 member organizations. So we welcome the Council's recommendations and the ongoing input of stakeholders in how we can strengthen this type of cooperation.
So that's a very ambitious agenda if it all comes to pass. How different or similar is that from the types of discussions you're having about SMEs, which I understand are also going on in Trans-Pacific Partnership?
Well, I don't do the Trans-Pacific Partnership chapter, but actually, I think it's all a part of the since 2009 in the Obama administration, we've had a greater focus on small business with a small business initiative to across our trade agreements, but particularly we have an opportunity with these major, significant trade agreements with our partners in the Asia Pacific, and particularly with the EU, because we have 4 years of kind of already laying the groundwork to identify very specific types of issues, service providers, cooperation that we can undertake. Clusters is another example where the EU is really advanced in this area. The US is also sort of identifying, sector-specific clusters and regional clusters where there could be US-EU cooperation. So I think that the special nature of the transatlantic relationship, our high levels of development, our strong levels of labor and environmental and consumer protections, the ease with which Americans and Europeans, we're always vacationing in each other's markets, so increasing tourism services and education services exports between our countries. I think that augurs very well for strengthening cooperation so that more SMEs can participate in transatlantic trade and find customers and partners.
So let's hear finally from last but not least, Damien Levy. And then I'm going to open the floor and get a conversation going, I hope, with those of you in the audience. Christina has, as I said, laid out a lot of things. Some of the things that she mentioned, such as SMEs being able to send data across borders, and some of the e-commerce aspects of this, I know have sometimes been challenges within the internal market itself and in the single market. Is there a special role of SMEs in the single market, and how are you approaching this from the European perspective in the TTIP negotiations? Are there certain things that you're finding that she's put forward that you find more agreeable, less agreeable? Where are your ambitions for this?
Well, first of all, Christina has done a great job in laying out the common ambition for TTIP, and she's so enthusiastic. I'm really impressed. Second, the data that Raj mentioned earlier is interesting because you see that European SMEs export much more.
Yeah.
I think they've taken advantage of everything we've done since Europe 1992. You remember the internal market, and so it's kind of normal for SMEs to enjoy the scale advantages of being able to sell first to 300 million and then now to 500 million consumers that you have within the European Union. And I think having done that step, it's kind of easier to export outside the European Union. That's probably what explains the 13%, which is a striking difference compared to the ratio of US SMEs exporting. But still, much more can be done. And what we see in TTIP is a great opportunity to strengthen the efforts we've been doing over the last years, the colleagues in DG Enterprise in particular, and the enterprise networks, and also all the trade promotion efforts that our member states are doing. As you know, the way we share work is our member states, embassies, and our member states back in Europe, they do a lot of trade promotion and investment promotion activities, and we focus more in a way on regulatory issues and also international negotiations. So I think we largely agree on TTIP, and also in the SME chapter, we think, first of all, it's important to recognize the importance of SMEs, and that's why we agreed to that US proposal. As you said, it's the first time we've done it. No, it has to be more than a symbolic gesture, definitely. Right. So it has to be a tool to increase information. You mentioned the huge information gap and the challenge that SMEs, I mean, we've heard good stories, and there are many more out there, and I'm actually impressed that you take the time to do this exercise, because normally SMEs, the bosses, just want to focus on getting more business done, basically. So it's great that you do this kind of advocacy work. Now, with TTIP, we think we can do more to provide information to SMEs with platforms, with information on products, on specifications. To be frank, I'm not sure several platforms is easier than one platform. We think a one-stop shop is better, but never mind. I think the aim is to provide easily accessible information for SMEs, knowing what are the rules out there. Second, on the market access part, definitely we're looking at tariffs. I mean, that's the kind of traditional thing that we do in trade agreements. Here, the size of the relationship, the amount of money we're talking about, means that it will be beneficial to SMEs. Public procurement, more transparency in public procurement, like we've done with our Canadian friends, is very useful for SMEs, we think. I was surprised rules of origin were not mentioned in your report. That's a complaint we hear a lot. It's once you go, it's a spaghetti ball issue. That once you do preferential rules of origin, it's a challenge not only for SMEs, but also for bigger companies who say, you know, who cares if I have to comply with very specific rules of origin? I'll just pay the duty. It's going to be because it's cheaper than to comply with rules of origin. So I think rules of origin, trade-enhancing rules of origin, is also something that we need to achieve in TTIP. Even though you're not recommending it, I think that's something we will try to do. And on the regulatory issues, whether you export your 100 machines of new steps or 1,000. The cost of figuring out the certification requirements, the inspections and all that is just the same. It's a fixed cost. And so it's much higher for an SMEs than for a large multinational. And so this is the innovative part of TTIP compared to other trade agreements, as we know. And that's an area where a lot of great work has been going on in a number of sectors, including medical devices, but pharma, chemicals, they've been mentioned. And that's an area where regulators are on board and doing the work, and trade negotiators kind of are present and try to help the process go forward. But it's really owned by regulators, and I think this will deliver tremendous benefits for SMEs.
So do you know, or Christina had mentioned certain sectors that are heavily populated by SMEs in the United States. And I'm wondering if there's I mean, we all know the German Mittelstand, small exporters. I don't know if they hit the 249-person limit.
Mittelstand is up to 5,000 employees.
Up to 5,000, so that's a bigger. But Roy had mentioned how close he thought the regulations actually were in terms of his particular industry, and that he hoped that they would actually, that those differences would disappear. Are you optimistic that in some of these areas, like medical devices or some of the other things that are central to SMEs, that we might actually see some compatible licensing requirements and testing and perhaps even mutual recognition that would help SMEs? Or is it too early to predict?
No, yes, I am. I'm hopeful. It's much easier to agree on common rules where there are no rules than agreeing on common rules where we have, longly established rules.
Right.
But we need to do both. We need to do both, looking at equivalence requirements, mutual recognition. We're doing it across sectors, looking at the various tools that we have out there. And it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, but it's a lot of work because there are no low-hanging fruits. We've been looking at this for 20 years. Now we have a great momentum, and minds are focused on both sides to achieve this. So I'm very hopeful that this will happen. But this will take time, and regulators need to feel very comfortable of saying, okay, the rules is different, but actually the effect is the same. I have the data is robust, and I trust the regulator on the other side so we can go ahead.
Right. Okay, thank you. Can I bring in the audience here? Yes, in the back. And wait for the microphone, and please identify yourself.
Yes, Lem Bracken, Bloomberg BNA. I wonder if Damien or Christina could give us an update on the status of the SME chapter in the TTIP negotiations and identify any outstanding issues, maybe one or two, to help us understand where the negotiations are right now.
Well, she's an SME negotiator, so.
We have been discussing text since, we've had now 7 rounds of negotiations. So we have a draft joint bracket consolidated text. I think we have a lot of commonality, as Damien had said, on elements of the chapter and deepening and enhancing cooperation between the U.S. and EU on issues that have been identified by SMEs, on enhancing the panoply of information and tools that we can help provide to SMEs to help them take advantage of the benefits across the agreement, and of creating an ongoing sort of permanent institutional platform where government representatives on both sides, and it's DG Trade and USTR, but also our interagency colleagues at the Department of Commerce, at the Small Business Administration, at the State Department, DG Enterprise and Industry on the EU side, other DGs, to be able to convene both government experts directly with our SME stakeholders on both sides on an ongoing basis as the agreement is implemented, to make sure that we continue to address issues and make sure that the agreement is delivering benefits for small business as the years go by.
Do you have any sense of the time frame that you're looking at for this chapter?
Well, I mean, it's a part of a whole comprehensive agreement. So we're looking at, chapters across the TTIP, but I think we can say that, in SMEs, both the US and EU place a high priority on the importance of SMEs as engines of economic growth and innovation and job creation, which is something that we both recognize is essential to our economies, and that if we can reduce trade barriers throughout the agreement that disproportionately burden SMEs and unlock transatlantic opportunities so that more of these SMEs in specific sectors and across the Atlantic can find each other as customers, as suppliers, as distributors, as partners through online e-commerce opportunities and harnessing the, I think it was $944 billion on e-commerce online between just the US and North America and Europe alone last year. Huge, huge potential for SMEs.
Right. Is another question there?
Wolf Brookman with the American Chamber of Commerce in Germany, based here in Washington. I wondered if the panel could address the issue of perceptions of the regulatory environment, both European perceptions of the US and US of Europe. I'm thinking, for example, in Germany in particular, surveys have shown that something like 90% of German citizens perceive the regulatory environment in the US to be considerably lower and less effective than that in the US. And I think there are in other countries too, you have this perception issue. Could you discuss how that would impact these negotiations, the fact that there are perceptions on both sides about their respective regulatory systems?
Let me first bring in Roy and then Elena. And Roy, you started exporting to Europe, and you must have said at one point, why am I doing this? The regulations are just too tough. Did you find that that was a perception, that there was a big difference between the perception and reality? And is one lower and one higher, or are they just different? And Elena, I'd like to hear your comments on the same for your market as well. I mean, there must have been times when you had to justify to the CEO of your company that you were actually spending all this time dealing with regulatory issues.
Exactly, yeah, that's a great point, and I think I mentioned earlier that having to go through that process internally is an obstacle, or can be, to exporting in and of itself. The good news for us is we're a company that's very, very focused already on meeting requirements for the US market and exceeding them. So it's kind of an obsession of ours. Our company is owned by a biomedical engineer, and so we're very technically oriented. And so everything that goes out at the doors for US consumption is already at a very high standard. So the way I see it is meeting the requirements for CE mark for exports to Europe. It wasn't so hard in terms of having our product to be compliant. It was more just finding out what the requirements are, and they do change periodically. And so, it's not like we have a resource in-house who's flipping through those, regulatory books every day looking for changes. So just the process of finding out what they are, staying current with your understanding, then finding outsourcing that to the third parties that participate in that regulatory process with us. All of that is the barrier, okay? Versus actually having a product that meets those requirements. So, Roy, I don't know how that's different for you.
Well, I can remember flying home from Germany and being on the plane and saying, I can't figure out how to do it, and I can't get the product here at an effective price. How am I going to ever get this accomplished? However, I took it on hard and kept digging. As you mentioned, getting partners in Europe to help you because they grew up in the environment, so they are used to it. So in my particular case, I partnered up or actually hired people there that would help me with it, and then got a lot of this information by reading. For example, on REACH, if we just wanted to bring up an example, my products I have to certify relative to REACH, which is a regulatory agreement on what different types of materials and chemicals are involved with your product. And it sounds terrible, but then if you sit down, you break it down into categories, and you start working with it and taking your time to go through it, you will become the expert on it. And pretty soon you'll probably know more about it than your European counterparts, because you're really studying it. So it takes some time. But that's okay. The rewards are there on the other side. And if you follow the rules, first of all, the rules are all written down. They're not like ghost protocols that you run into. I'm sure people are familiar with this term, ghost protocols. That's where they keep, especially in Eastern Europe, like in the Eastern European countries, they'll continuously bring up a new regulation that's not really a regulation. It's just brought up to stop you from selling. It's not that way in Europe. The rules are written down. They are in English so that we can understand it. And if you step by step follow through with it, you will come to that all of a sudden it really isn't so bad. And they also depend in Europe. The situation was brought up about from the floor that their rules and regulations are at a higher level. I don't really think so. I'm working in products that are at the very highest level, relative to health and human safety, and they're just written in a different fashion, and the Europeans pay more attention to the rules and regulations. I'd like to bring up a point that here we pay more products liability insurance for our products that are sold in the US than the products liability I have to carry in Europe, because they consider that the insurance companies consider that the regulations are higher in Europe, and so there's less chance of a product liability lawsuit. In fact, I have quite a cost savings on that because it's a large factor. And on the tariffs, my products range from 3.5% to 6%, depends on the product. And the VAT, it's not a dirty word, but it's something that we in the US have to become familiar with the VAT. And this pay forward system of the VAT, how it works, how it impacts the final price, and the differential of when Europe, who ships to the United States, versus us shipping into Europe, is going to create a differential. And I think that's one of the areas that the US exporters are going to start squirming on relative to this agreement. And I know we've talked about VAT before, and the Treasury is involved associated with that. But 19% it's a lot more. For the end user, it's a pretty big number. So, because we're not familiar with a value-added tax here in this country, that's going to be a big hump for our exporters to get over and get used to.
Right. Have you all had any feedback in terms of the regulations are higher in Europe, or more severe in Europe, or stronger in Europe, however you want to put it, versus and how that is impacting the negotiations? I do hear this just back from Germany. I can tell you that at least on not the manufacturing side so much, but some of the agriculture and other things like that, one does hear that a lot. And it is a problem with the European public. So how do you all answer that charge?
Well,
or is it?
We've heard it a lot, definitely. If you remember when the day after the State of the Union speech, February 13 or 12, 2013, President Barroso, on our side, announced that we would launch procedures to get a negotiating mandate. Well, one of the first things he said, we will not lower our standards. And so from day one, we've kept on saying that. But of course, as long as you don't have a trade agreement that is finished, you can't show it and then explain that it won't happen. So we need to keep on reassuring people and keep on explaining what are the potential benefits. And by having the regulators on board and having them also explain that they will be very cautious, very prudent, we will reassure slowly but surely the public. And you need to keep on doing that. That's just keep on repeating. And I think the perception we need to educate as well. And I think Americans and American, for example, ambassadors in Europe are doing that to explain that actually the US is a regulated market in many areas. And there's a lot of just ignorance, I think, to a certain extent. And there's a moral judgment, obviously, definitely in a number of areas we think our regulations in Europe are just higher and better. And it's often, as we know, these moral judgments are often based on ignorance.
Do you want to say anything?
Yes, I mean, our goal in TTIP in the regulatory area is to reduce the costs and burdens associated with, duplicative testing, duplicative certification, sort of arising from unnecessary differences without in any way lowering the high standard of, consumer health, labor and environmental product safety that our consumers on both sides have come to expect. In many areas, the U.S. regulates to a higher standard in organic products, sometimes in auto safety and other issues. But the idea here is that, I think as President Obama and Ambassador Froman have made very clear that, maintaining our high levels of environmental and consumer protection are absolutely essential, and they would never be, compromised in that regard.
Right.
I mention one more thing about the regulatory. Really quick.
Yes.
I think that in the European market, the regulations were built from an academic and from universities and bringing these different academic people together to bring up and develop the standards or the norms, as they call it. Whereas in the U.S., and if we use ASTM as an example, American Society of Testing Materials, the standards are more or less industry standards, and it's a groundswell of people that get together and work from industry and develop these standards. And so the standards were developed in a different way, and that's what you're having as the rub when you're trying to get these to meld together.
Okay. Let's get a question in the middle of the row here.
Hi, Matt Keller with the Embassy of Liechtenstein. I see two major voids with TTIP in the United States and in Europe, and they're very different in nature. Of course, in the United States, it's just simply lack of awareness. There's a lot of Americans who simply have no idea it's out there. And of course, then the void that there is in Europe is this skepticism and fear of what it could mean to doing their own standards. And I think SMEs can play a critical role in all of this. And I just want to know a little more about what is being done in the United States amongst SMEs to raise awareness. And also from a logistical standpoint, as we move forward into the new Congress, there's Trade Promotion Authority, and you guys are on the front lines in Michigan and in California, calling your members of Congress, calling your senators, calling your governors to support this. Is there an effort on that level, and is the United States, the USTR and other commerce helping you in doing that? And then also on the European side, how can SMEs assist you and be used as an asset to really promote how TTIP could help them?
So, do you all want to say what you've been doing in this regard? Because you're both on different councils and things like that.
Exactly. So first of all, I want to mention I totally agree with you that lack of awareness is a big barrier to trade for U.S. companies. There's a lot of support, a lot of information. The U.S. Commercial Service is a great resource. If any company went out and tried to hire a consultant to help them with the type of export promotion activities that the U.S. Commercial Service does, they would have to pay 2-5 times more for those consulting services than what the U.S. Commercial Service provides to companies. The problem is a lot of companies are just not aware that that's out there, that that resource exists, and it's so cheap. You know, it's out there and it's affordable. And then I think a lot of companies are just so easily persuaded by public opinion and media. So I also wanted to mention that as media or as opinion makers speak in front of cameras, when they speak to reporters, they have to think about how their words are interpreted by little companies that have maybe 1 or 2 people inside of them that focus on exporting. They don't have the internal, it's not in their DNA, it's not in their company culture. So everything that they hear that comes to them from the media, they take to heart, and it can very quickly become scary and overwhelming. So that's just a comment about awareness. But your question about what we're doing, so here, Roy and I are here, a couple of people kind of briefly described our bios. So I think we live in an incredible country just because we have an opportunity to participate alongside with our governments in reviewing some of the texts. So as an advisor on the Industry Trade Advisory Committee, I actually get to see some of the texts and provide feedback on behalf of my company. I mean, that's crazy. That's incredible that I can participate at that level. We get to speak on these panels. We get invited to speak in front of our colleagues in the European Union. So we have a lot of channels to provide input to the negotiators, to our governments, and let them know what it is that's really important to us. And I'm always kind of humbled and wowed by that, because I come from a small town in Michigan. I work for a small company. We don't have a lobbyist up here. And yet we get to sit at this table and participate in the process at that level. So I think we're very fortunate, and I encourage more companies to speak up and participate and look for ways to do this, because as you can see, the right people want to hear from us. And I'm the person who actually gets to do this, right? I sit in the economy seat on the flights over to Europe and eat the free peanuts and whatever they give me. So,
I'd like to. I'm, as mentioned, the chair of the National District Export Council. So we have 1,500 members. You're one of the members there, and I'd like to tell people that they all have an average of 10 years of exporting experience. So we have 15,000 years of exporting experience in one organization, and if you have a problem, we can solve it from experience. And these are all volunteers. They're working within society. We work not only business to business, but we also work to B2G to feed the information back up to Christina or to others to explain how could this go better, where can the changes be. I was speaking with Bill Reinsch today earlier, and the satellite rule has now changed, been published as of Monday of this week, where commercial satellites are off of the ITAR and onto the under control of the U.S. commercial. It came off of the ITAR and onto the Commerce Control List, so that it has less regulations and regulations that are appropriate for commercial satellites. Now that's an example of groundswell and work that went through to get this change done, which means actually billions of dollars in exporting. How did it happen? It happened through a whole lot of work over a lot of years to get this type of stuff done. And in this particular case, and as the TTIP goes into place, the TTIP will need to be disseminated out and will be involved with it. Now, I have something that I can guarantee you is a portent of why the TTIP is going to go through. I had come back from Europe, and I had flown straight here to D.C., and I forgot to change my money. And so I have a pocket full of euros, and I'm in the taxi cab, and I go to get out, and I tell the guy, I said, I'm going to have to pay you in euros. And he says, no problem. So TTIP for sure is going to go through.
So now you have talked to a lot of SMEs. Are you hearing similar things in terms of, and how many SMEs do you think are aware of TTIP and the benefits? Is there an education process we need to do?
There's definitely an opportunity here for sure. By the way, I was in London yesterday and I had to pay in dollars, so it worked out just fine. I think, your point earlier, Elena, but, we work a lot with U.S. Commercial Service, and we have had, very long and deep relationship with them. We've done several trade missions to several countries with them. But it is it's a real challenge. Again, the number of SMEs, I think the studies like we've just completed is very important. So these kind of numbers are put in front, especially the ones that you said about the ones that export are growing at 36%, the ones that don't grow declining at 7%. Those kind of things, are really at the end of the day, bread and butter numbers. Right. And that's got to get communicated. I think we definitely have a challenge, but I think that we can do better and we should do better.
Right. Do you two have things about, the education effort that needs to happen?
Definitely. At USTR, we're very small, but we do try to leverage all of our people. So from Ambassador Froman, this is very important to him. So on I think almost all of his domestic trips, he meets directly with small businesses that are selling abroad, whether it's a firefighter safety device company in Boston, or a brewery in Colorado, or companies in Ohio and Texas and California, wherever he goes, meeting with members of Congress as well as small businesses in those districts. And what we're certainly, even in the TTIP, what we're trying to do is to put a face on, who are these hundreds of thousands of exporters like Elena and Roy across the country. So in March, when we issued a joint US-EU document on opportunities of the TTIP for SMEs, we sought to include some stories in that document. 5 on the US side, 5 on the EU side. Klinga Corporation of York, Pennsylvania, with 50 employees making refrigerated power container systems, exports all across the EU, uses inputs as well from the EU to manufacture a finished product in York, Pennsylvania that's then exported, and they won a $7 million contract from the Sweden Defense Force. But these are jobs in your town that are supported already by transatlantic trade, and through which TTIP could further lower these barriers so that companies can expand and hire more, and Roy can expand his production facilities, which he hopes to keep up with all his new orders from Europe. We're also trying to leverage, as I'd mentioned a lot, sort of the service providers, not only the U.S. Export Assistance Centers, but the U.S. Small Business Development Centers across the U.S. So I regularly go to the annual meetings of the Associations of Small Business Development Centers, which are SBA-supported counseling institutions. Basically, they're primarily located at universities around the country. There's over 1,000 of these. The nearest ones in Washington are Howard University, George Mason University. Under the Small Business Jobs Act in 2010, all of these SBDCs are now required to have international trade counselors within the Small Business Development Center. So if you train the trainers and you educate the trainers who are interacting, 1,000 centers regularly interacting with small business clients around the country to help them grow their business and consider exporting, and realize that our free trade agreement partners are easier markets for small businesses to do business, because we've lowered the tariff or eliminated the tariff barriers and addressed non-tariff barriers, and dealt with customs procedures and facilitation, and helped strengthen intellectual property rights protection. And I think when we through this kind of both at the top level with Ambassador Froman meeting directly with companies, as well as meeting with associations that serve small businesses on a daily basis, we can get the message out about TTIP.
We work a lot with SMEs, and I'm sure we'll do more with the new commission. Also, simply internally, for the reasons that were mentioned before, it's an engine on growth, innovation, and so forth. It's a challenge, as I mentioned in my earlier remarks. To get SMEs spending time on explaining why trade is good is a challenge because our projects are long-term projects. If you look at TTIP, if you look at other trade negotiations, CETA, we just concluded after 5 years. So SMEs are not patient enough to, well, 7 years, I want to survive, right? The death rate among SMEs is quite high. So that's a challenge, but it's key to have the real faces, real stories explaining what are the challenges, what are the regulators on the other side, and how long it took. I think the report does a great job in highlighting a number of stories, and we need much more of that. And for example, including in Germany, that's one of the ways to get public opinion turning a bit. When I was in a debate in Brussels of the Green Party, and I explained my story, I did my spiel about TTIP, and the key Green MEP said, you know what? I don't care, and I explained that a friend who makes chocolate in Belgium, exporting to the US, wants to export more. He has the organic certificate label in Europe and then here. And he said, I don't care whether your friend makes more money or exports more and hires more jobs because I'm much more concerned about all the bad things that could happen with TTIP. So I think we need more SMEs selling what actually, you know what? I employ 5 persons, and with this, maybe I'll employ another one, or I'll hire on part-time basis, and then you need more of that because, we need just more jobs. The unemployment rate it's there. Young people, much higher. The first job, so
right.
Just be there.
So we have time for one more question from the audience, if there is one. But before I open for that, I want to warn everyone. I'm going to ask you, I'm going to ask you 3. What is the #1 thing you would want to see in TTIP that would help SMEs? One thing. And then I'm going to ask you 2 to respond. But is there another question from the floor? Yes. And you get to include your answer to this question in that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Joanne Thornton. Excuse me. Get rid of my papers. I'm with Policy Connections International. Thank you very much for a great panel. And I wanted to follow up on the last question a little bit about the information gaps about trade policy and TTIP in particular. We talked about jobs a little bit, Damien did. But there's another gap, and that is there's an antipathy toward imports. Exports are good, and we've heard a lot about exports here. Exports are politically good, and imports aren't. And I was curious to know from our business panelists here, how important is it also for you to be able to access components, say, from overseas? How important is that aspect of these international trade agreements for you? Thanks.
Okay, so that's like the company that you spoke about in York, Pennsylvania, that it's part of a global supply chain. The response to her question, and then also what's the one thing you want to see out of TTIP?
First of all, two-way trade strengthens all agreements. If we look at business agreements like a business marriage, and if I think about my wife, and if it was only a one-sided agreement with my wife, I don't think that would last too long, would it? So we have to make it work in both ways. I know I've brought over technology. I brought over molecular precursors from Europe that were unfinished projects and brought them back here to the US and completed them out in laboratories over here. And I've certainly paid a lot of taxes in Europe. Back and forth is a very good way to strengthen this, and it will naturally occur because it will be the relationships back and forth that will make this enduring. Remember, we're not just talking about 2015. We're talking about forever and the future as this thing goes forward. And they will strengthen and develop over time. There's unique circumstances in Europe as there are here. And those will then become available for both of us. As far as for the one thing, and I'm sorry to be harping on it continuously, but the #1 thing is going to be working towards an eventual regulatory environment that is standardized between And I think that as far as the USTR is concerned, Roy's opinion is for you guys to set the framework for that to get done, but then to let the different regulatory agencies work it out over a period of time. Because you can't just wave a magic wand. You'll get resistance. But if you say, we want it to be achieved within X time, let each of you guys, each of these organizations work it out, that will get done. And ISO has been helpful in this area already. I don't know if you have an ISO. Okay. So I have an ISO. I've been 12 years under an ISO 9000 for my company. It helps understand these types of regulatory circumstances a lot. And I really couldn't sell in Europe without having my ISO 9000 certification, or registration is the way it's supposed to be said. And so in that, it would be the regulatory, which is what I would like to see eventually, but I don't want to see it done as a hammer. I want to see it done where each of the regulatory agencies on both sides work it out over time.
Elena.
Sure. I think that's a great topic, a great question. So specific to our company, we don't have reliance on imports. It's a company strategy to rely as much as possible on locally produced components, and then we manufacture most of our stuff in-house. But we do import a few pieces, so it's not really a big component of our strategy right now. But like Roy mentioned, we're thinking long term. So I think to have the foundation for imports and exports for manufacturing is a very important topic. But I do want to say that I like the idea of two-way or import and export relationships with Europe because, and this kind of ties in nicely to my one thing that I had to pick, those interactions, the more of them we have between companies, between suppliers, between importers and exporters, the richer is that, I don't know, environment, I guess, for finding the right partners. So my comment about what is the one thing that I want to see happen out of the SME portion of TTIP is how can our governments come together to find ways, platforms for US and EU SMEs to interact, because the magic really happens when people are interacting. So I'll give you a specific example with our exports to Denmark, it's a tiny country, but we're shipping containers and it's going like gangbusters. And I would have never predicted a couple of years ago that we would have this kind of success. We started with a distributor. They spent a lot of time explaining to us why our product will never succeed in Denmark. It's expensive, it's this, it's that. They sold nothing. And then talking to our German distributor, he introduced me to another guy who happened to be in Denmark. And this Danish guy was looking for another product to add to his product portfolio. And we were just chatting. It was a social situation. We ended up talking about New Step. I gave him my business card. He checked us out on the web. One thing led to another. And we decided to give it a try. And so now we have this, amazing supply chain in Denmark. And that happened because of networking with someone else. And we just happened to be in the same room. It was a totally casual social conversation. So a lot of our success in our exports actually comes from these types of interactions. Some of them are formally put in place through the U.S. Department of Commerce. They have a matchmaking process. You have to sign up for it. But others come just from kind of bumping into each other. So I don't know how we can institutionalize that, bumping into each other. But those types of interactions, imports, exports, people being in the same place, in the same industry, talking to each other, that's what I'd love to see more of.
Raj, what would be the one thing that you would see that might come out of TTIP that would really change the game for SMEs?
Yeah, first let me say, clearly we see trade as a two-way street. And, this is built on the first principles of trade. We have a small business contest every year. Last year, small business winner was up in Montana, importing goods and then making it and distributing and value adding and sending it to the U.S. And very small business, but really expanding very successfully. And in this day of virtual and physical networks, when they really are now coming together. Now, in terms of what's important to us, what's important to our customers is what's important to us. So I think the regulatory coherence that you talked about, I think that's really critical. I think if we do that, I think it's just the standards are already so high, and I think if we can make it such a way that it is coherent, and then I think we'll be all better off.
Great. Christina, are we going to get this?
Yeah, I'd like to answer this
sure.
lady's question about inputs. It's a great question, and actually, I think it's not widely realized that about 49%, so almost half of our imports from the EU, are inputs into finished products in the U.S. that are exported. So these the transatlantic supply chain relationships and the participation of SMEs in these supply chain relationships is critical. I mean, I was earlier mentioning like a big company like Siemens. Well, what's in it for small companies? So Siemens, just to give an example, got a contract to build 70 high-tech Amtrak trains in the United States. So they're manufacturing in Sacramento and Georgia and Ohio. They're using a supplier network of 60 suppliers in 23 states, and many of these are SMEs. So there's an SME called Bentech with 80 employees in Pennsylvania that manufactures the grab bars on the outside of the trains, and Siemens is their biggest customer. And there's National Fire Systems in California with 12 employees that's manufacturing the fire extinguishers that go into all of the trains. When we talk about, I've met with German companies in the Mittelstand, like a Feuer Powertrain outside of Leipzig they started from a green field with nothing. They now have 500 employees making crankshafts. Okay, so those are imported into the U.S., but their U.S. business is growing so much, they're breaking ground to create 300 jobs in Alabama with high wages and worker training that they see as essential to retention of U.S. employees. So small businesses are participating in the supply chain, are creating jobs on both sides of the Atlantic. I've met with Polish SMEs that they just export to the EU now. They'd like to export to the United States. They're hoping that TTIP, I met with a chemical retardant manufacturer. But guess what? They already use inputs from the United States. So I was talking with the CEO, and he said, oh, yes, I hope greater chemical regulatory compatibility will get to sell in the U.S. So I was asking him about his product. He goes, oh, well, we source all of our chemical compounds from the United States. And, oh, yes, well, the valves that we use on our spray cans, those come from the United States, too. And so it really is it's a two-way trade relationship that will help our SMEs thrive. And at least speaking for the U.S. side in terms of objectives, we're seeking what our small businesses are seeking. So I like how Roy put it. Let's set a regulatory framework and then let the regulators sort of get to it. And what we see as essential is this regulatory coherence aspect, which is cross-cutting. Transparency, participation, accountability. Put these regulations in development, online, the impact assessments. Let small businesses from wherever they are domiciled comment on these on regulations that could impact their business and allow them to influence the process while it can still be influenced. And then let the regulators, we've done it before in the U.S. and EU. We've done it in aviation. We've done it in organic mutual recognition. So we know that it's possible. And then in terms of the business-to-business contacts and networks that are so crucial, the SME chapters is seeking to create and institutionalize those networks on a permanent basis through leveraging our agencies like the Department of Commerce, U.S. Foreign Commercial Service, and the Enterprise Network. So we're actually holding TTIP SME seminars and trade shows and networks and matchmaking throughout, more and more in the member states in specific areas like, with biotech, for example, a trade show in Germany and one in Chicago, where we can bring together SMEs in these sectors and better leverage government resources from Commerce and DG Enterprise to work together to help your businesses find each other.
Damien, last word from Europe.
Should I add anything? Well,
what about those objectives?
Well, first of all, on harmonization, I think it's key that in the negotiations we achieve a number of outcomes. We can't let everything for the future. We have a unique opportunity, unique momentum. We need to grab it and achieve a number of things in the agreement itself. So regulators need to agree on a number of things concerning the existing rules already in the negotiations. We can't wait for tomorrow for all the rest, because tomorrow will be a long time. Second, on the regulatory aspect, for us it's also very important that there is structured debates and discussions and organized regulator to regulator upstream. You identify a problem, how do we look at it? What are the options that we look at on both sides? And we can't wait simply for draft rules to be published, and then you wait, and then the final rule is published, and you observe that there are divergences between the two ways. So we need to combine more transparency and participation through the way each side does it, but also with much more structured and organized regulator-to-regulator dialogues to achieve real outcomes. Because otherwise we just observe diverging outcomes. So we need to do both, I think. And if this is the last word I can say, our chief economist published recently a paper which is not TTIP specific, but it's just challenges and opportunities for exporting SMEs. So useful piece of work. And also, while we negotiate, we also do a sustainability impact assessment. It's an outside consultant doing this, and they're doing a survey until the end of the year on challenges faced by SMEs exporting to the United States. So that's another thing that will inform us in the negotiations, but also later on.
Great. And if you send us the link to that report on exporting for SMEs, we'll give it a shout out in TTIP Action, and everyone who's here who's signed up for TTIP Action can see that. Mm-hmm. So thank you so much to the panel. I think this has been really interesting hearing the real life experiences and our Washington policy experiences. And thank you all for being here and for asking really good questions. And thanks very much to FedEx for making this type of work possible. And we hope that this report will be the beginning of a process of educating about the role and importance of SMEs, both in the economy and in trade. So thank you all. Thank you.